Hello and welcome, I'm Oles Garduk and you're watching Head to Head with UATV. Ukraine is not alone against Russia, but the West has not woken up yet. This is a statement by defense reform expert in the Ukrainian Institute for the Future and former Lieutenant Colonel at the British Army, Glen Grant. And today we're lucky to have Glen in our studio. Hello and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
So what did you mean by this statement? Could you tell us?
Well, I think that the war in Donbas and the Sea of Azov really have not been picked up properly by the public in other, certainly in European countries and in America.
Mm-hmm. So how do they perceive this information from Ukraine?
Well, there's a lot of false information coming out from Russia,
okay,
and
of course.
And there are obviously a lot of journalists who've been who are either too frightened to actually to tell the truth, or who've made an offer that they can't refuse to continue to actually to say that this is a civil war or something like that, completely missing the point that, of course, Sea of Azov cannot be a civil war because they're Russian vessels and it's well documented. But it's I think that the trouble is people are trying to hide away from it, because if they don't hide away from it, it means they have to do something.
So, do you mean that this is a general perception of the conflict in the east of Ukraine, that this is a civil war?
Yeah,
this is the
I think there's a general perception
throughout
still,
the whole Europe.
Even if people don't believe that it's a civil war, two things to that. One side is that Russia continues to push that they're not involved, and there are lots of people who believe that. And the other side is the human nature thing, that if you actually believe that Russia is engaged in war in Europe, you've got to take it seriously and do something about it. So people are actually trying to hide away from the reality of war.
But at the same time, Russia has been involved in many cases worldwide, now interfering elections in different countries. Their military actions have been proven in Syria, the Salisbury case in Britain, and also the conflict in the east of Ukraine. Would people really believe that
Yes. Yeah,
Russia is not guilty?
No, they do. They do, because partially they're worried about it, but partially it doesn't affect them.
Okay, so that's why they don't care.
It doesn't affect them, so they don't care. And the other thing is that the Russian public relations campaign is much, much stronger than Ukraine's public relations campaign. And frankly, Ukraine's public relations campaign is pathetic. It's weak, and it's weak because it's too centralised, and because there's frankly the diplomatic corps of Ukraine are not pulling their weight. And if you don't have a good diplomatic corps, you don't get your message out in countries.
So you think that this is a purely diplomatic approach that we would need to? No,
I don't mean that. I mean this is your balance. Part of this warfare is a balance between the Russian publicity campaign, with all their bots, with all their money, with all their daily attacks on people, on ideas, and the Ukraine retaliation is tiny. It's limited. It's limited to a few very good volunteers who are doing it themselves.
How should Ukraine react, in your opinion?
Well, Ukraine, first of all, it needs to have a strategy. And I mean, that's the big thing. There isn't a proper strategy. Or if there is, it's secret. And it's no good having a secret strategy in a country, because then nobody else can help whoever has got the secret. So it needs a strategy, and it needs then to actually change the organisation at the top level to work on that strategy. So you need to use bright people.
If we're talking about strategy, what is Putin doing now strategically with Ukraine? How do you think?
Pressurizing, just gently turning the screw, day on day on day on day, trying to create splits between organizations and people, putting the pressure on Ukraine, on Azov region by basically putting the financial screws on Mariupol and the border there, and he's doing it extremely successfully. But what he's going to do next, I have no idea, but it will be something different. It won't be what the Navy commander said, an attack on Mariupol. That's too obvious. And the one thing about this whole game that Putin's been playing is he hasn't followed the obvious.
Well, this question was not casual and was not mine either. It was actually yours from the article you published in Kyiv Post in January this year. And I want to quote you. in this article you were saying that Putin wants to breed a feeling of helplessness, and he's playing political games with the West around Minsk and peacekeepers that blinds other nations to their real game. Actually, these negotiations on introducing peacekeeping mission on the territory of Donbas are still ongoing, however, no result yet. How do you think, how efficient could this UN mission be in current Ukrainian reality?
I don't think it will be. No, I think it's a red herring. It's put in there.
It will not
Putin.
be implemented.
No, it's just another delaying tactic
to keep some negotiations.
To keep negotiations going, and to delay, to keep the problem going, not the negotiations going, the problem going. Because by saying this, Putin has then got another stick he can beat Ukraine with and say, "Oh, you're not fulfilling your part, we are not going to allow peacekeepers in." He's not going to allow peacekeepers up to his border. He is at war with Ukraine. So peacekeepers is a nonsense. It's another activity. In a way, it's a nonsense activity for Ukraine to understand, because it actually delays the inevitable, which is that Ukraine has to eventually do something. And trying to look for little ways or hopeful ways of delaying Putin isn't going to work.
How would you expect Ukraine to retaliate?
First of all,
with all forces?
Not necessarily with all forces. I mean, I keep saying you've got to build your forces properly, because there's no diplomacy without having forces behind.
Forces.
So you've got to have strong forces to have diplomacy. When you've got strong forces, then you should be using all legal methods. Law, international organisations, diplomacy, and the diplomacy is weak, as I said, and public relations, and so there's got to be a proper system of doing this. Otherwise, it's just sitting back and waiting for Putin to take his next step.
Well, speaking of this powerful forces and powerful strategy, the headline actually of that article that you have published in the Kyiv Post was called "How Ukraine Can Build an Army to Beat Putin." So, how could you briefly answer to this question? Because the article was long. Yes,
the article was long, and the question was it's like asking how to reform the national bank and the banking system. This is a really complex subject. But I think
straight to the point. Because you're the first expert who is saying that UN peacekeeping mission is not going to help, and maybe you have some other alternative advice for us.
Well, I think the alternative advice was effectively what I just said. First of all, prepare the forces properly so that Putin is frightened of them, and the reform means a lot of different things in different areas of the military. But I mean, the most important thing is to sort out the system. Not the boys at the front are brilliant, and they're getting better all the time. They must be, because they're still alive. So if you're still alive at the front, you're doing something right.
Yes, they have to survive.
Correct,
they've
got to survive.
Option.
But that's an adjustment. I mean, when you go behind the front line, then still the logistics system is still weak and doesn't work properly. And it's changing things like that. The command system doesn't work, because the commanders at the higher levels are annoying the boys at the front line. Instead of supporting the boys at the front line, they're annoying them.
So what should be changed in this system?
People.
Is there some misunderstanding?
People first.
Okay.
First. And then putting into place people that understand what is needed in the front line. In other words, frontline commanders have got to take more senior posts in the military. Then they have got to sort out what they want to make the front line work.
But then these frontline commanders also should be changed.
You're going to have to move some frontline commanders out and bring in others.
Well, yeah, somebody has to start.
Somebody has to do it, but that means stepping up, and it means captains and lieutenants stepping up to become majors. And remember, in the Second World War, many people started as private soldiers and ended up as lieutenant colonels. And the Second World War was only the same length of time as this one.
Yes,
that is true. So there are lots of people. I mean, I've met several captains that could command battalions, but they're only commanding companies, and they're good people. And the systemic faults in the system are not identifying those people and moving them into good positions. In fact, some of the better people have been moved out and put into quiet positions to keep them quiet, instead of moving them into, sector commander or something like this. They're sidelining them, and that is no good.
So, first of all, changing the staff. Second, well, since 2015, Ukraine has been reforming its army to in order to be compliant with the NATO standards, and we were having deadline by 2020. Well, from what I understood from the previous experts that were here in the studio, we're running late by this deadline. But still, how would you evaluate the results so far?
Well, the results, as I said, at the front line, behind the front line, the results are...
There's defense capabilities.
The results are patchy. And I think that you'll see, for example, when they've been doing a lot of housing, and there was a lot of shout about building 184 barracks this year. I think that when you see the results of that, it will not be 184 built. In other words, there's going to be a lot less actually finished. And this is a systemic problem of management and governance inside the defence system. So
they do report about some amount of...
They do report about some things that actually they're doing, but then when you actually come and look at them, they're not actually either as they seem or as people say. For example, the food. The food, you know, people talk about how good the food is and how wonderful it is now in barracks, but at the front line there are still boys that are not getting their provisions properly every week. And the front line is where it counts, not a barracks.
Not a barracks. What about modernization of the equipment? Because we have been always hearing that Ukraine is modernizing its military and defense equipment, weapons, it's digitalizing documents.
You're not going to fight a war with digitalized documents. You know, what we're talking about should be improved tank sites, improved armour, improved spares for the spares and quality of spares and availability of spares for vehicles. And those things are not working as well as they should do. And also the system, the business system for bringing the best ideas from the civilian defence market into defence is not working at all. And actually, some of the people have got there's some brilliant ideas. There's some brilliant IT systems being made at the moment by Ukraine firms that are world-beating. And the defence system is not taking them, and quite simply because, in one or two cases, because people will not pay under the table to get their system accepted.
How could IT systems help improve?
Oh, a lot. I mean, for example, an IT system, an IT chip into a tank site, which actually increases the accuracy of the sight and improves the ballistic understanding of the sight itself, so that instead of being able to fire accurately at 2 kilometres, you can fire accurately at 7 kilometres or 6 kilometres, and that makes a huge difference.
Much more
effective. That's a technical IT solution. Of course, it's much more effective.
There was also a very troubling issue with the communication at the front line. Units could see one tank at the same spot, and all of them would report about it to the Security and Defense Council of Ukraine in Kiev, and it looked like we had a whole division to conquer at the front.
This is an intelligence problem, and it's been talked about a lot. That there's no proper intelligence system within the defence forces, the tactical level. So there's no analysis at battalions, analysis at brigades, analysis. They don't have the staff, and this is partly because in the old Soviet time, when you had a Soviet structure, then all that the Soviet Union wanted people to do was to drive forward and die, you know, attack the enemy. Yes. So they didn't need intelligence. You just drove until you were hit, and then you just carried on attacking. I mean, that's the
just as a piece of meat.
Just as a piece of meat. Whereas if you're sitting in the Donbas, you need a staff that can analyse things, that can work 24 hours a day, and that, you know, the commander can sleep and deputy commander takes over, this sort of thing. But you need an intelligence staff in every battalion and in every brigade, and it needs to be a good one, trained to do that. Then you don't have this problem, because the intelligence staff says, no, that's the same one as this one. That's what their job is.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation, and thank you for being a guest today in our studio.
Delighted. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure for us. That was Glen Grant, a defense reform expert in the Ukrainian Institute for the Future and former lieutenant colonel at British Army. Thank you for watching Head to Head. I'm Oles Gerjuk. Goodbye.